I thought I was just a janitor who couldn't resist tidying books. Every night in Dr. Caldwell's sprawling library, I dusted the shelves and quietly rearranged his collection, slipping little reading suggestions beside his armchair like breadcrumbs for a curious mind. I was certain my midnight librarianship went unnoticed, until the evening he summoned me to his study and spoke the words that froze me in place. "I know what you've been doing." In that instant, I was sure my life as I knew it was over. The Caldwell Manor was the kind of estate you usually encounter in novels, grand, intimidating, and steeped in wealth far beyond what most people dream of. I'd been working there for 6 months as part of the night cleaning crew, and every time I walked those echoing marble halls, I still felt like an intruder trespassing in someone else's world. My assigned post was the library, but calling it a library was like calling the ocean a pond. 3 full stories of shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, rolling ladders that creaked like theater props, and leather reading chairs that probably cost more than my car. The collection itself could make university librarians weep from envy. Dr. Caldwell, the reclusive owner, was rumored to have over 50,000 books. The problem, he had no system. I discovered this on my very first night while dusting what was supposed to be the philosophy section, only to find a cookbook wedged between Nietzsche and Descartes. A sappy romance novel leaned against a biography of Einstein. First editions of Dickens were scattered on different floors as if someone had tossed them from a balcony. It was beautiful, infuriating chaos, and it made my English literature degree ache. I'd graduated from Brookhaven University 3 years ago with a degree in English Lit and starry-eyed dreams of working in publishing or academia. But dreams don't cover student loan payments. The job market for English majors was about as welcoming as a locked library door. I applied to publishing houses, literary agencies, and universities, dozens of them. The responses were always the same: "We're looking for someone with more experience." Or worse, "We've decided to go with another candidate." The few interviews I managed ended with polite smiles and suggestions to keep building your portfolio. Meanwhile, the reality of bills crept in. Rent wasn't going to pay itself. Loan notices arrived like clockwork, and my savings account was circling the drain. That's how I ended up here, dusting a stranger's priceless books while secretly trying to bring order to the literary chaos he didn't even seem to notice. When my best friend mentioned that her cleaning company was hiring for night shifts, good pay, flexible hours, no experience required, I swallowed my pride and applied. "It's just temporary," I told myself as I filled out the application. "Just until something better comes along." That was a year and a half ago. My parents, both factory workers, tried their best to be encouraging. "You're gaining real-world experience," my mom would remind me on our weekly calls. "And you're still reading, still learning. The right door will open." But standing inside that magnificent library every night surrounded by more books than most people will ever see, felt like its own quiet torture. I had spent 4 years studying literature, even written my senior thesis on the evolution of the unreliable narrator, and I could talk for hours about the themes running through Toni Morrison's work. Yet here I was, being paid to dust the spines of the very books I longed to read. The irony stung every night. I was probably the most overqualified cleaner in the city, working in the most disastrously unorganized library I'd ever seen. At first I tried to ignore it. I was there to clean, not critique a billionaire's lack of cataloging skill. But as the nights passed, the chaos gnawed at me. These books deserved better. They deserved to be found, read, loved. So I started small, just a few volumes moved here and there, collecting all the Shakespeare in one place, grouping the poetry, carving out a little section for contemporary fiction that actually made sense. Then I got bolder. Miss Ashford, the reclusive owner of the estate, had a massive leather reading chair positioned by the tall windows, always with a book on the side table. The titles changed every few days, and I began to pay attention. He read everything: literary fiction, history, philosophy, biographies, even the occasional thriller. One night I spotted him deep into a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The following evening, I placed "Go Set a Watchman" beside his chair, along with a note scribbled on an old library card I'd found in a desk drawer. If you enjoyed Scout as a child, you may find her as an adult, equally fascinating though more complicated. A fellow reader. I didn't dare sign my name. If he complained to the cleaning service, I needed to disappear into anonymity. The book vanished. Encouraged, I tried again. When he was reading Murakami, I left the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle with a note on magical realism. When I found a Churchill biography by his chair, I left Barbara Tuchman's The Guns of August with a suggestion about wartime leadership. Each book disappeared. Each note vanished. And slowly, the library began to change. Books started returning to the shelves I had organized. Entire sections began to take shape. Order was quietly replacing chaos. I told myself he probably hadn't noticed. Men like Jonathan Ashford had staff for everything. Maybe someone else was following a system I hadn't understood, but secretly I hoped. I hoped he was reading my recommendation. I hoped in this vast cold mansion someone was discovering new worlds because of my secret midnight librarianship. Jonathan Ashford was a legend in the tech industry and a phantom in his own home. I had been working at the estate for 6 months, and had seen him only a handful of times, always from a distance. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with dark hair that looked as though he often ran his hands through it while thinking, and an intensity in his gaze that made you feel as if he could see through walls. The other staff spoke about him in whispers, and none of it was particularly reassuring. He had fired the last librarian for moving a single book without permission. No chance to explain, just a brisk order to have security escort her out. Another time he made the chef redo an entire dinner party menu because the salad course was served on the wrong plates. The man noticed everything and forgave nothing. The stories painted him as brilliant but impossible, successful but solitary. He had built a tech empire worth billions, yet according to the staff he trusted no one and seemed to like even fewer people. That made my secret book organizing project feel increasingly dangerous. Every night as I shifted volumes and tucked away my little notes, I imagined the inevitable conversation where I would have to explain myself. "Well, Mr. Whitmore, I know you didn't ask for my opinion, but I thought you might enjoy some Toni Morrison after finishing that James Baldwin biography." It would be a very short conversation, ending with my immediate dismissal, but I couldn't stop myself. The library was too beautiful, too full of potential to leave in chaos, and the books I recommended kept disappearing, which had to mean something. I began noticing other details too. The reading chair was always angled to catch the best daylight. A pair of expensive reading glasses sat on the side table with a prescription that suggested hours of use. Sometimes I'd find multiple bookmarks scattered about as though he was reading several books at once. This wasn't someone who collected books for decoration. This was a man who read them, who lived with them, who needed them. One night I found a notebook beside his chair. The pages were filled with handwriting I assumed was his book notes, quotes, hurried reflections, scribbles that looked like someone trying to trap ideas before they escaped. I didn't dare read it fully. That would have been too much of a violation, but seeing it made me feel less alone in my obsession. Somewhere in this mansion was another soul who believed books were worth noting down, worth having conversations with, even if those conversations were one-sided. It made my secret curation feel less like trespassing and more like collaboration. 3 weeks into my unauthorized reorganization project, I made a discovery that changed everything. While shelving poetry I'd rescued from 3 different floors, I noticed something strange. The books I'd been recommending weren't just disappearing, they were coming back, but placed deliberately in carefully chosen spots. The Toni Morrison novel I'd suggested after he finished Baldwin was now grouped with other African-American literature. The Barbara Tuchman history I'd slipped in was shelved neatly among other narrative nonfiction. Someone wasn't just reading my suggestions, they were integrating them into a system. Encouraged, I began leaving more detailed notes. Instead of simple recommendations, I explained connections between authors, themes, and historical context. When I found him reading 1984, I left Brave New World with commentary on how Orwell and Huxley envisioned different, equally chilling futures. When he finished a biography of Marie Curie, I recommended The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, adding thoughts about science, ethics, and the narratives we craft about discovery. My notes grew longer, more personal. I began to share not only what I thought he might enjoy, but why those books mattered to me, how they connected to conversations about art, humanity, and the way we live. I was having the literary dialogue I'd always longed for, even if it was one-sided. Then, one night I found something that made my heart stop. Beside his reading chair sat a different notebook, left open as though waiting for me. In the same precise handwriting, a message was written: to my mysterious librarian. Your recommendations have been extraordinary. Your insights, thoughtful and illuminating. I find myself looking forward to discovering what you'll suggest next. Thank you for helping me see my own collection with new eyes. A grateful reader. I stared at the note for 5 whole minutes, my hands trembling around the dust cloth. He had known all along, and instead of being angry, he was grateful. Suddenly, the library wasn't just my secret project, it was ours. That night, for the first time, I didn't feel like an intruder in the Whitmore estate. I felt like a collaborator. I left a longer note than usual, along with my next recommendation, The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I wrote about the magic of libraries, about how books find their readers, and how stories forge connections between strangers. And at the end, for the very first time, I signed it with my real name, Eliza. The call came on a Tuesday morning just as I was walking through my front door after my shift. I'd been working at the estate for 7 months. and my secret correspondence with Mr. Harrington had been going on for nearly 2. I had grown comfortable with our literary exchange, bold enough at times to even disagree with his reading choices in my notes. "Miss Carter?" The voice on the phone was crisp, professional. "This is Evelyn, Mr. Harrington's personal assistant. He'd like to see you in his study this afternoon at 2 p.m. My blood turned to ice water. "I'm sorry. What?" "Mr. Harrington would like to meet with you today at 2 p.m. The address is—" "I know the address," I interrupted weakly. "May I ask what this is about?" "He'll explain when you arrive. Please use the main entrance." The main entrance. Not the service door I'd been using for months. This was serious. I spent the next 4 hours in a state of panic. He knew about the books, of course he did. That much was obvious from our note exchange. But perhaps he had decided it had gone too far. Maybe someone had complained. Maybe I had crossed a line with one of my recommendations or comments. I thought about the note I'd left the night before with a copy of The Book Thief. I had written about the power of words, about how books could survive even when everything else was destroyed. Had that been too personal? Too presumptuous? I changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple black dress appropriate for either a job interview or a funeral. Given my current situation, it could very well be either. The main entrance to the Harrington estate was even more intimidating than I'd imagined. Marble steps led up to massive oak doors that probably weighed more than my car. I rang the bell and waited, my heart pounding against my ribs. Evelyn turned out to be a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a reassuring smile. "Miss Carter, right on time. Miss Harrington is waiting for you in his study." She led me through halls I had only seen in darkness, past rooms filled with art that belonged in museums. Everything was beautiful, expensive, and slightly cold, like a very elegant hotel where no one actually lived. The study, however, was different. Smaller than I expected, lined with books filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that suggested someone truly worked there. Papers were scattered across a massive desk, coffee cups sat uncollected, and reading glasses lay abandoned in at least 3 different places. And there, rising from a chair by the window, was Jonathan Harrington. He was taller than he had seemed from afar, and his eyes, dark brown, sharp, seemed to notice everything. But what struck me most was that he looked tired in a way that went deeper than mere lack of sleep. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice warmer than I had expected. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit down." I perched on the edge of a leather chair, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl called before the principal. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked you here," he said. "I have some idea," I answered quietly, "and I want to apologize. I know I overstepped. I shouldn't have touched your books without permission, and I definitely shouldn't have left notes. I couldn't help myself." He studied me for a long moment, and I braced for the lecture about boundaries and proper behavior. Instead, he smiled. "Miss Carter," Miss Harrington said, settling into the chair across from me, "I need to show you something." He picked up a tablet from his desk and tapped the screen a few times. "This is the security feed from the library. I've been watching you work." My stomach dropped. Of course there were cameras. Of course he'd been watching. I was about to be fired, possibly even arrested for theft or destruction of property. But when he turned the tablet toward me, I saw something I hadn't expected. The footage showed me from the night before, carefully moving books, dusting shelves, and yes, leaving my note by his reading chair. But the way he had edited, the video looked less like surveillance and more like documentation. "I've been watching you reorganize my collection for months," he said. "At first I was annoyed. No one touches my books without permission. I was ready to have you fired." I winced. "But then I started paying attention to what you were doing. You weren't just moving books randomly. You were creating systems, building connections, making the collection more accessible." He gestured to a stack of books on his desk. "And your recommendations, every single one I've followed over the past 2 months. They've been extraordinary." "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I know I shouldn't have." "Stop apologizing," he interrupted firmly. "You've done something remarkable here. You've taken a collection I accumulated but never properly organized, and turned it into something functional. More than that, you've introduced me to books I never would have found on my own." He rose from his chair and walked to the window, his back to me. "Can I tell you something, Miss Carter? Something I haven't told anyone else?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'm going blind." The words hung in the air between us. My breath caught. "It's a genetic condition. Degenerative," he continued. "I've known for 2 years it was coming, but it's accelerating faster than the doctors predicted. I can still see, but reading is becoming difficult." The words blur together, especially in low light. I have maybe 6 months before reading becomes impossible. He turned back to me, and I saw the pain in his eyes, not physical pain, but the ache of someone staring down the loss of something essential. Books have been my escape my entire life. When I was building the company, working 18-hour days, facing board meetings and hostile takeovers, I'd come home and read. It was the only thing that kept me sane. The only thing that felt real. When the diagnosis came, I started buying books frantically. First editions, rare manuscripts, entire collections. I told myself I was preserving them, but really I was hoarding, surrounding myself with all the stories I might never get to read. He gestured toward the vast library beyond his study. 53,000 books, Miss Carter, and I was drowning in them. They were becoming a monument to everything I was about to lose, instead of a celebration of everything I had loved. Then you started organizing, and more than that, you started talking to me about them. Your notes weren't just recommendations. They were conversations. You shared your passion, your insights, your love for literature. For the first time in months, books felt like friends again. Instead of reminders of what I was losing, I finally found my voice. Mr. Harrington, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. Be interested, because I have a proposition for you. He leaned forward, his expression intense but hopeful. I want to offer you a job, not as a cleaner, as my personal librarian and reader. I want you to properly catalog and organize my collection. I want you to read to me, to help me experience books in a new way. I want you to be my eyes in the world of literature. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. The salary would be $150,000 a year, plus benefits, he said evenly, and a housing allowance. If you'd like to live here on the estate, you'd have complete authority over the library, a budget for new acquisitions, and the freedom to organize the collection however you think best. My mind reeled. $150,000 was more than I'd made in the past 3 years combined. It was life-changing money, but more than that, he'd trust me with his collection. Miss Carter, Mr. Whitmore said, his voice steady, you've already proven yourself. You've treated my books with more care and understanding than I have. You've shown me connections I never saw, introduced me to authors I never would have discovered. You've reminded me why I fell in love with reading in the first place. He pulled out a folder from his desk. I've had my lawyers draft a contract. Take it home, read it over, think about it, but I hope you'll say yes. I need someone who understands that books aren't just objects, they're doorways. And you've already proven you know how to open them. I said yes before I even read the contract. 3 weeks later, I was standing in the library, my library now with a team of professional catalogers, a new computer system and a budget that made my head spin. Mr. Whitmore, Julian, as he'd asked me to call him, had given me complete creative control over the reorganization project. But the best part happened in the afternoons, when the catalogers went home and it was just the two of us. I'd never read aloud to another adult before, but Julian was a generous audience. He listened with the kind of attention that made every word feel important. When I read dialogue, he'd smile at the voices I gave different characters. When I reached a particularly beautiful passage, he'd ask me to read it again. We started with The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo because I thought he'd enjoy the storytelling structure. He was fascinated by the way the narrative unfolded, by the complexity of the characters, by the themes of identity and reinvention. I never would have picked this up on my own, he admitted during one of our sessions. I would have dismissed it as not for me. But you're right, it's brilliant. That became our pattern. I'd choose books that challenged his assumptions, that took him outside his comfort zone, that showed him new perspectives. We read literary fiction, poetry, memoirs, classics he'd missed, and contemporary works reshaping the literary landscape. And we talked, oh how we talked about themes and characters, about the way authors used language, about how stories reflected and shaped the world around us. The conversations I'd always dreamed of having, the literary discussions I'd imagined in graduate school, they were happening every day in that beautiful library. Julian was brilliant, insightful, and surprisingly funny. He had theories about unreliable narrators and strong opinions about the Oxford comma. He could quote Shakespearean sonnets from memory, and had read every Agatha Christie novel at least twice. You know, he said one afternoon as I finished reading a particularly moving passage from Beloved, I used to think losing my sight would mean losing books forever, but this is different, better, in some ways. When you read, I hear things I missed when I read silent, the rhythm of the language, the music and the words. Really? I asked softly. Really? And having someone to discuss the books with immediately, that's something I never had before. Reading was always solitary for me. This feels like community. A few weeks into our reading routine, Julian set down his coffee and looked thoughtful. Can I ask you something personal, Clara? Of course. Where did this love for books come from? The way you talk about literature, it's not just casual reading, there's real depth there. I smiled, thinking back. My grandmother, actually. She was a librarian in a small town in Oregon. Every summer my parents would send me to stay with her and she'd let me help at the library. I was maybe 8 years old, stamping due dates, and shelving picture books thinking I had the most important job in the world. That sounds magical. It was, but the real magic happened at night. Grandma would make hot chocolate, and we'd sit in her living room, which was basically a second library, and she'd read to me not children's books but real literature, Steinbeck, Harper Lee, even some Dickens. When I got older, she'd stop every few pages and ask what I thought, like my opinion actually mattered. Julian leaned forward, genuinely interested. She sounds wonderful. She was. She used to say that books were like people. Some you'd like immediately, some would grow on you, and some would challenge you in ways that made you better. She taught me that reading wasn't just entertainment. It was conversation with the greatest minds in history. Is that why you studied literature? Ethan asked. Partly, I said, but also because I wanted to understand how stories work. Why some books stay with you forever while others fade. I thought I'd become a professor or maybe work in publishing, help bring new voices to the world. I paused, remembering the optimism I'd felt walking across that graduation stage. What happened? He asked. Reality, I said with a rueful laugh. Turns out the literary world is a lot smaller and more competitive than I had imagined, and a lot less interested in hiring recent graduates with big dreams and small bank accounts. So you ended up cleaning instead of curating? Yes. But you know what's funny? Working in your library even as a cleaner felt closer to my grandmother's world than any of those jobs I applied for. Being surrounded by books, even if I couldn't read them all, felt like coming home. Ethan was quiet for a moment. She'd be proud of you, I think. Your grandmother. You found a way to honor books, even when the traditional paths were closed to you. I hope so, I said softly. She always said, the right book finds you when you need it most. I never thought that applied to jobs too. 6 months into my new position, Ethan made another generous gesture. He'd noticed that my commute from across town was eating into my reading time and costing me a significant portion of my salary in gas and rent. I have a proposition, he said one afternoon. There's a guest cottage on the property that's been sitting empty for years. It's fully furnished, has its own entrance, and it's about a 5-minute walk from the library. Would you be interested in living there? I could adjust your salary to include housing as part of your compensation package. I was stunned. The cottage was charming, a small but comfortable space with a fireplace, a modern kitchen, and large windows that looked out over the estate's garden. More importantly, it would allow me to save money and be closer to the work I loved. Are you sure? I asked. That seems like too much. Carrie, Ethan said gently, you've transformed not just my library, but my entire relationship with books. Having you nearby means I can focus on literature instead of logistics. It's practical for both of us, and I thought you might like to live closer to the books. I moved in the following month. Living on the estate felt surreal at first, but it quickly became home. I could walk to work through beautiful gardens. I had my own space to retreat to, and I was saving enough money to finally start paying down my student loans aggressively. But the best part was watching Ethan rediscover his love of books. The sadness that had shadowed his eyes when we first met was gone, replaced with curiosity and excitement. He'd gotten a guide dog, a golden retriever named Dickens, and had started attending literary events in the city, using his new perspective to engage with books in ways he'd never considered before. You changed my view of literature, he told me one evening as we finished the midnight library. I thought losing my sight meant losing stories. Instead, it meant finding a better way to experience them. A year later, Ethan decided to open his library to the public. 1 day a week, we started hosting reading groups, author events and literacy programs for local schools. The library that had once been a private treasure became a community resource, a place where people could discover the same magic that had brought us together. I still leave notes by his reading chair sometimes. Old habits die hard, but now they're not secret recommendations from a mysterious librarian. They're messages between friends. Between two people who understand that books aren't just entertainment or decoration. They're bridges between past and present, between different perspectives, between people who might never have found each other without the magic of a shared story. And every afternoon, when I settle into my chair and open a new book, when I hear Ethan's footsteps and Dickens' gentle panting as they join me in our library, I'm reminded that sometimes the best stories aren't the ones we read, sometimes they're the ones we live. A beautiful story about hidden talents, unexpected connections, and the transformative power of literature. What book would you recommend to someone trying to fall in love with reading again? Share your suggestions in the comments below. If this story of books, second chances, and finding your calling touched your heart, please hit like and subscribe for more uplifting stories about discovering where you belong. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next